Recovery contains a paradox. I am powerless, yet I must take action. This paradox revolves around God. In that I am powerless, God must act in my life. Yet to find God, I must take action. The solution of this paradox falls into two errors, the theistic and the atheistic error. The theistic error says that since my recovery is ultimately dependent on God, then I don't need to do anything I don't need to take any action. God will do everything for me. The atheistic error says that my recovery is completely dependent upon my action, that my action itself is a higher power. I will word in what, in my opinion, is the solution this way. I need to take action to open myself up to God, but God Himself effects the psychic change, something I am powerless to do. My point is that the higher power is the principle of recovery, yet He is indispensable. Recovery revolves around God. Now we come to the truth about the 12-step recovery, that each forms his own conception of God, and the experience of many thousands has shown that this is sufficient for recovery. The question I ask then is this: is God necessarily irrational or non-rational? Is knowledge of God limited to the intuition of Him gained through the steps? Is a higher power personal to each individual? Or is there any universal truths about God that applies to every man? In other words, is God entirely subjective? Is there anything objective about God? My entire work so far has been founded on the first principles of Aristotle. Can examination of these first principles elevate us to God? It is in answer to these questions that I would like to end my paper with formal proofs for the existence of God. These are powerful ideas that I think every searcher of truth needs to be exposed to. These ideas show us that God is not limited to the non-rational or irrational. There are things that can be known rationally and certainly about God. There are universal truths about God, the denial of which necessarily involves the denial of the first principles of causality and contradiction and identity. These ideas of God are congruent with first principles and with the God I have already exposed the reader to in this paper. My purpose in writing this is to expose my reader with an open mind to a deeper idea of God. This is not meant to convince an atheist or agnostic, for I believe nothing can do that. Now here, the atheist, the agnostic, raise a good objection. All knowledge comes through the senses. The only thing man perceives through his senses is matter. There is an infinite difference between God and the material universe. Therefore, man can't come to knowledge of God. This is a good doubt. But the answer to this doubt is that for every effect that exists, a cause must pre-exist. Stated another way, from every effect, the existence of its proper cause can be demonstrated. We bridge the gap between God and the finite reality by investigating causality. If God is the ultimate cause, He can be known through His effects. But causality must be properly understood. Causality is transcendent and ontological. Causality is an immaterial truth that transcends matter. For example, the nebula is the cause of the star, and the mother and father the cause of the child. If causality were merely an attribute of matter, then no truth would be found between the nebula and the parents, for their matter is distinct. But here the objection might be raised that in understanding the causality of the nebula and the parents, I am making an abstraction, that causality exists in the mind. To say that causality exists in the mind is to say that it does not exist outside my mind. But this cannot be, for causality has ontological validity. What I mean by this is that causality is an objective law of being that exists independent of my mind. Everything exists has a cause. Causality is founded in the very first principle of contradiction and identity. If I violate the law of causality, I violate the principle of identity and contradiction. For example, suppose something is uncaused and contingent. If it is contingent, it does not exist of itself. If it doesn't exist of itself, it must exist in another. But it can't exist in another because it is uncaused. If it doesn't exist in another, and not in itself, it has no reason for existing. Therefore, it is nothing. And from nothing, nothing comes. Another example. The law of causality can be summarized this way. The greater doesn't come from the less, the more perfect from the less perfect. But if we were to posit that the more perfect were to come from the less perfect, we would have something that exists with no explanation. Yet everything that exists has an explanation. Therefore, it would exist, yet not exist, a violation of the principle of contradiction. The point is that the law of causality is a law of extramental being, and the violation of causality leads to the violation of the first laws of being. Another important thing to understand is that an infinite series of subordinated causes is absurd, as I have already said several times. Let us consider the four causes. In the material cause, there must be a first matter, a prime matter, on which secondary matter is founded, such as wood, earth, and flesh, and so on. If flesh were composed of prime matter, and prime matter of some further matter, and so on into infinity, there would be no matter, and the material cause would be destroyed. In the formal cause, there must be a supreme genus into which all being is divided. For example, substances that are irrational and rational are part of the sensitive. The sensitive and the insensitive are part of the living. The living and non-living are part of the corporeal. The corporeal and incorporeal are all that exists, which is the supreme genus. But if we were to continue this process to infinity, nothing would be intelligible or definable. This also applies to the efficient cause. If I need a paper towel to wipe my face, and the paper towel comes from the store, and the store gets the paper towel from the factory, and so on into infinity, then I will never be able to wipe my face, because an infinite series of subordinated causes does not explain being, because it is an infinity of contingency. Again, with a final cause. If I do something for a purpose, and that for a more remote purpose, and so on, into infinity, then my life would have no purpose, and I would have no reason to act. So I would like to introduce to you the first of St. Thomas Aquinas' proofs for God's existence. And it may be a surprise to know that this first argument for God's existence was not put forward by a Christian, but actually by Aristotle 2,300 years ago. And all further proofs are merely developments of this one by St. Thomas Aquinas. It's a fact. There is motion in this world, from the lowest to the highest orders. The motion of the earth around the sun, the motion of waves across the sea, the motion of the animal in search for food, the motion of the intellect from ignorance to knowledge, and the motion from the addict from motion of the addict from addicted to recovered. And by motion, I mean any type of change. And by change, I mean the transition from potency to act. The question now is raised: if everything is in motion, is there nothing that endures? Is there nothing stable and absolutely permanent? How are we to explain motion? Is the explanation of motion found in itself? Is it its own reason, its own cause? All motion requires a mover. For in the terminus of motion, something new exists that requires an explanation, a cause. And motion only takes place in something that is movable. Now, this is nothing but the transition of potency to act. How are we to understand this transition? Remember, the law of causality can be summarized as: the more perfect cannot come from the less perfect, the greater cannot come from the less. Something cannot move itself from potency to act, because act is more perfect than potency. Act contains a perfection that was not previously found in potency. Otherwise, the greater would come from the less. The transition from potency to act requires a cause, some other that is an act. In other words, all motion requires a mover. Now, we have two options. If the explanation of motion is not found in itself, but in another, then we either have an infinite series of subordinated motions, or we have a first mover. As I have already shown, an infinite series of causes is absurd, because it is an infinity of contingency. To say otherwise would to say that a clock can run without a spring, as long as we have an infinite number of gears. Or a paintbrush could paint of itself, as long as it has an infinitely long handle. Therefore, there must be a first mover. Only in a first mover is there an explanation for all the motion we see in the world. This first mover must be its own action, since it didn't receive what it has from any higher order. If there is nothing of a higher order that acts on the first mover, then he contains no potency. If it contains no potency, there is no transition in him. He is immobile. Not the immobility of inertia, but he already contains in himself what he imparts on others by motion. In other words, he is pure act. That which is pure act, pure being, the immobile, supreme mover, we call God. Only being itself, which alone exists of itself, can, in the last analysis, account for the being or the reality of a becoming which is not self-existent. From this we have two important points. One is that the universe is not God. God is essentially distinct from the universe, for the universe is in constant motion, but God is immovable. All of creation contains a composition of potency and act, but God is pure act, being itself distinct from composite reality. The second point we have is a rough explanation of how God works through the steps. It is not mysterious. Recovery is a type of motion, a motion from potency to act. But as we have seen, motion is in the last analysis explained by an unmoved mover. God acts in the life of the addict as a first mover, and therefore affects the change from addicted to recovered. Now I would like to move on to the next argument for God's existence. The meat of this argument involves principles I have already introduced the reader to in my discussion of metaphysics. I am now bringing these principles to their rational conclusion. I beg my reader's patience as I repeat myself. In this world we see truth, beauty, and goodness contained at varying degrees and in varying objects. There is a gradation of truth, beauty, and goodness, which is to say, they participate in being to various degrees. A common stone contains beauty, but more so a crystal. And if we look higher, we find the beauty and nobility of a plant is higher than that of the stone. Higher still is the beauty of an animal with its sensation and motion and instinct. Then we have beauty of man with its intellectual and moral life. And some are more beautiful than others. And physical beauty is transcended by the beauty of the soul. Compare the beauty of an actress to the beauty of the wrinkly face of Mother Teresa. Compare the ugliness of the alcoholic in his cups to the beauty of soul expressed in the gratitude of one who has recovered. So truth, beauty, and goodness are contained at varying degrees. But even at its summit, we find truth, beauty, and goodness so imperfect, lacking so much. It could be so much more. The saint who does so much good feels impotent when he realizes the good that remains to be done. And the genius, with all his insight and knowledge, realizes most acutely how little he knows. Does this ascending gradation remain stunted, incomplete, and without a summit? Must the progressive ascent of our minds toward the truth halt at a limited and imperfect truth? Must the progressive ascent of our will to the good halt at an imperfect good, mingled with some defect, mingled with some impotence? Recall, when I talked about metaphysics, I said being, truth, beauty, goodness, because of its simplicity, cannot be divided of itself, but is limited because of composition. Therefore, when beauty, truth, and goodness, the concept of which implies no imperfection, is found in an imperfect manner in varying degrees in different things, none of those which possess it imperfectly contain a sufficient explanation for it. Hence, it requires a cause on a higher order. This will become clearer when we consider the multitude and the imperfect. This part of the argument was put forward by Plato, who said, "The multitude presupposes the one. Multiplicity does not explain unity. If I give money to the homeless, you could say that this is a good. But goodness is not only found in me, for a mother who loves and labors over her child is also good. And a saint who accepts martyrdom for his faith is likewise good. If we admit that this goodness is a real goodness that exists outside the mind, that each genuinely participates in goodness, then we need an explanation, a cause for the goodness that they share and why. Because multiplicity does not explain unity. Each are insufficient to explain the goodness they share, for if the goodness originated in each of the above examples, there would be no unity between them. Each would be a distinct truth, because different causes have different effects. Therefore, this unity requires a cause on a higher order, and this is goodness itself which they participate in. The origin of goodness is outside of them. The multiplicity presupposes the one. The imperfect is a compound of the perfect and a limited capacity for perfection. Recall that being is not limited by itself because of its simplicity, but is limited by potency. Existence is limited by essence, and form is limited by matter. A compound cannot be united by itself, just as something cannot move itself from potency to act. The compound of goodness with the limited capacity for goodness requires an external cause, just as every motion requires a mover, and in the last analysis, the compound requires a cause that is perfectly simple, perfectly one, just as motion requires a supreme mover. Does this make sense? If the cause of a compound was itself a compound, and so on to infinity, we would have again an absurd reduction to infinity. Therefore, the compound requires a cause that is perfect simplicity, that is truth itself, that is beauty itself, that is goodness itself. And this simplicity explains the nature of truth, beauty, and goodness. For if we look at the true, we find it is also beautiful and good. Likewise, the good is also beautiful and true. The conversion between the transcendentals is explained by the simplicity of the Supreme Being. That which is the summit of truth, beauty, and goodness, that being which is supremely simple, we call God. To quote St. Thomas Aquinas, different beings are said to be more or less perfect in the measure to which they approach that being which is perfection itself. And to quote Reginald Garrigal-Lagrange, when a perfection such as truth, goodness, and beauty, the concept of which implies no imperfection, is found in varying degrees in different beings, this cannot be accounted for by any of those beings in which it is found, in as yet an imperfect degree. The being merely participates in it. It has received it according to the measure of its capacity. It has received it too from a higher being, who is that very perfection. What conclusions can we draw from this? What does this mean for our lives? First of all, we are not God. The universe is not God. God is actually distinct from the universe and us, being merely compound and imperfect. This should humble us, for ours is a borrowed existence, being a gift of life itself, life being a gift of life itself. And what every good is in us is mingled with so much imperfection. But the goodness that is in us does not come from us. It is a gift from above. This should be the goal of our life. We should seek out that absolute perfection. We should seek to participate more and more in goodness itself, beauty itself, truth itself. This should clarify recovery, which is participation in the truth despite ourselves. Through ordering our souls, we participate in beauty. In the acts of justice, we participate in goodness. And this should bring joy, for we are not limited to our little imperfect lives, but we can encounter the source of life. We can encounter supreme goodness, perfect truth, and limitless beauty. I would like to begin this final proof with a quote from St. Thomas. We see things that lack intelligence, act for an end, and this is evidenced from their acting always or nearly always in the same way, and so as to obtain the best result. So in the universe there is order and determinism and regularity. In the heavens, the sun is determined to produce radiation. The earth is determined in its motion around the sun. Can anybody doubt the regularity of the motions of the heavenly bodies? We see determinism in the sphere of life. The apple seed is determined to produce an apple tree and does so with regularity. It never produces a pear tree. And so on with the higher forms of life. Even man is determined to seek the truth, though he may choose not to. This determinism requires a cause, And just as the explanation of motion from potential to act is not found in itself, so the explanation for determinism is not found in itself. It requires an external cause, an external explanation. This is the principle of finality, that all means are directed to their ends. In the universe, we see purpose and order, and this is explained by the principle of finality. In the growth of an embryo, there is a beautiful genetic symphony that controls its development. All these genes are ordered to find their purpose in the development of the animal. And in the animal, we find various masterfully constructed organs for the purpose of the life of the organism. It is finality which explains the regularity of the universe. The pear seed regularly produces a pear tree because of the end which orders it. And out of the end, we could not say why this. Without the end, we could not say why the means was ordered to this instead of that. Not just anything comes from just anything. In the universe, there is purpose and order. In other words, all means are directed to the end, directed to their ends. But some may argue, don't we know from the theory of evolution that we all came about by random chance? First of all, it is inaccurate to say that according to evolution by natural selection, we all came about by random chance. Evolution contains an element of random chance, but it is not a completely random process. For example, natural selection doesn't randomly select any individual in a population, but regularly selects the best adapted individual. When something isn't random, it is caused. When it is caused, there is the principle of finality. Remember, as I said, the causes are reciprocal. So the principle of finality in evolution is not an opposition, in my opinion. From the principle of the means being directed to their ends, we can ascend to certain knowledge of God's existence. A means cannot be directed to their ends but by an intelligent designer. To quote Reginald Gargal-Lagrange, why do we need an intelligent designer? Because the end, which determines the tendency of the means, is none other than an effect to be realized in the future. But a future effect, which has not yet actual existence, must, to determine the tendency, be in some way already present. And this is only possible in a cognitive being. What this is saying is that order is explained by means and ends. The principle doesn't fully explain it of itself. In order to fully understand this principle, we must come to the knowledge of an intellect. And because of the relationship of this principle to time, this intellect must be outside of time. And because this intellect governs every means and their ends, it must be the supreme intellect. Only an intelligent designer can have directed means to an end. Otherwise, we would have to say that the greater comes from the less, order from disorder. Why is an intellect necessary? Because only intellect knows the cause, and the universe has purpose outside of man's knowledge. The universe doesn't gain purpose when man knows of it. This is because the universe exists in the mind of God. So, we come to knowledge of a supreme intellect that is truth itself, which is being itself, because being is truth that is known. This proof should bring comfort to those who understand it. We as humans have a final end, and we are not just thrown into this universe to realize it ourselves. There is a divine governor who orders the life of men to his end. and that end is not divorced from the order found in the universe. And because that governor is infinite, nothing in our lives happens outside of that order. All the unexpected difficulties we face is brought into that order of our lives and made good. And because this governor is goodness itself, all the evil we suffer, he is able to draw out a greater good. In other words, everything is exactly as it should be. And this thought should bring serenity. Everything is ordered by God. This is divine providence. I would just like to take a final moment to distinguish the intelligent design argument that I put forward from the intelligent design argument put forward by creationist scientists. The intelligent design argument was put forward by a scientist by the name of Michael Behe, and he put it forward as a scientific theory. The previous argument that I'm putting forward is a philosophical argument. Behe's argument revolves on the idea called irreducible complexity, which states in biology we see objects so complex that they could not have come from a series of finite steps, which Darwin stated was necessary for evolution. The previous philosophical argument I put forward revolves around the principle of finality. So they're two separate ideas. Behe's argument is bad science, and I do not adhere to it. So I would just like to add to those who are interested in what I've said and would like to read further on these subjects. I didn't make all this up. This video came as the result of a lot of reading. So I would like to add the main books that I used to you for your further reading. First, the ideas at the beginning of my paper by Roger Penrose are contained in a book called Road to Reality. My explanation of metaphysics were mostly based on the commentary of the books of the Physics and Metaphysics of Aristotle by Thomas Aquinas. These are free on the internet. I also used the Metaphysical Thought of Thomas Aquinas by John Whipple. I also used a book called Reality by Reginald Garrigal-Lagrange. That can be found free on the internet. The foundation on the chapters on psychology were based on St. Thomas's commentary on Aristotle's De Anima, which means on the soul. The treatment of specific aspects of psychology was based on the Introduction to the Science of Mental Health by Father Ripperger. I am extremely grateful to Father Ripperger, for much of my paper is based on his book, and this paper would have been basically impossible to write without his book. I also read the Summa Theologia by St. Thomas Aquinas, and this is the classic work of theology and can be found for free on the internet. My treatment of the natural law was based on The Natural Law by Jacques Maritain and the Introduction of the Science of Mental Health by Father Chad Ripperger. The treatment of the Four Cardinal Virtues was by Douglas McManahan, and the Summa Theologia by St. Thomas Aquinas. The explanation of the problem involving lack of integration was my own insight, but the philosophical explanation of obsession was based on Father Ripperger's book. The chapter on prudence was based on Father Ripperger's book and the Summa Theologia by St. Thomas Aquinas. The meat of the paper, the analysis of the steps according to the Four Cardinal Virtues, was based on the Four Cardinal Virtues by Joseph Pieper. This is a masterful work and can be found for free on the internet. I also read the Summa Theologia by St. Thomas Aquinas for this part. And finally, the proofs for the existence of God came from two works by Reginald Gargal-Lagrange called One God and Another Providence. And these can be found for free on the internet. So now we've come to the end of my very long series of virtue and alcoholism. And I hope I was able to introduce some new ideas and expose you to new ways of thinking about alcoholism and recovery. But in the end, after everything is said and done, what is the point of this video series? My understanding of recovery and alcoholism can be summed up in this way. Virtue is its own reward, and vice is its own punishment.